The 1990s quite possibly holds the crown for the most iconic decade of the entertainment world. Whether it's Dennis Rodman's Hair, Saved by the Bell, Pagers, Topanga, Parachute Pants, many refer to the 90s as the golden age for one thing or another, but it's usually the music. Grunge kicked out hair metal like it stopped paying rent, and hip-hop was at its peak form on all sides of the map. The innovation and experimental trends of all genres was in full force. The States were being dominated with a diverse group of musicians roaming free through the radio waves. But across the pond, there was something just as innovative happening. With a blend of hip-hop beats, electronica, atmospheric psychedelic sounds, and haunting vocals came a new genre that was never heard before, dubbed trip-hop by the press. The genre was born in Bristol, England, and although there isn't a specific birth date, many would say that the group The Wild Bunch would lay the groundwork for trip-hop, which gave birth to Massive Attack, whose 1991 album Blue Lines is considered the first trip-hop record. But if the Wild Bunch were the parents of trip-hop, and Massive Attack was the firstborn, that left room for the middle child, lurking in the shadows, haunting and dripping in melancholy. And that middle child was named Portishead. Co-founder of the group, Jeff Barrow, was born in the town of Portishead in England in 1971. A young aspiring DJ who learned how to scratch records at an early age, Barrow wanted to immerse himself in the music world as much as possible. At 9 years old, he started playing the drums, and by 14 he had a newfound influence of hip-hop, listening to records from African Bambaataa and the Soul Sonic Force. A pinnacle moment in his influence of hip-hop was when he first heard Public Enemy's Rebel Without a Pause while partying at an underage nightclub. Reflecting on this moment, he said, "When it came on, I had to sit down. I was absolutely floored by it. It was a life-changing moment for me. The enormity of Chuck D's voice and the enormity of the sub-bass and the complete fuck-offness of it. It was like punk. It was my punk." But Barrow wanted to make music of his own, and Portishead wasn't known for being a town filled with aspiring musicians.
It's just boring like everywhere else when you're a 15-year-old, or 12-year-old up or whatever. It's just boring, isn't it?
Which might have been a good thing, because it meant that we stayed indoors and Jeff got on with the music and what have you. And which is probably why it happened, actually.
Yeah.
There was nothing else to do. So it worked out in the end, I guess.
You have a lot of time to think about stuff. That's the other thing. You just have a lot of time to think about stuff. If you can't go into pubs and you can't have all the computer games you want as a kid, you know what I mean? Because you ain't particularly wealthy. You know what I mean? If you haven't got those things to kind of stimulate your mind, the latest BMX and all that kind of nonsense, then you end up down here just talking shit. And that talking nonsense actually, obviously, then kind of makes you think a lot. And when you think a lot, you think about what you're going to do when you get older, Because you don't want to be sat down here for the rest of your life,
In a Rolling Stone interview, when asked about his hometown, he said, "I don't really like Portishead. It's a place where you can go to die." He described it as looking really pretty, but actually being quite awful. When he was 17, he escaped the shipping town and he moved to Bristol, where he got a job at a recording studio called The Coach House, working as a tape operator and a T-boy, with the majority of his tasks consisting of getting refreshments for musicians recording in the studio. But in his downtime, Barrow would practice running the machines and experimenting with sampling. During this time, Massive Attack was recording their first album, Blue Lines, in the same studio. They were gracious enough to let Barrow use their spare studio time, and he continued to practice making his own music. He soaked in as much information as he could while working at the studio, and began the process of auditioning vocalists to lay down tracks over his instrumentals. And of course, fate played its part later in 1991 when Barrow ran into Beth Gibbons during a coffee break at an enterprise allowance course.
We were on a scheme that a government scheme that if you come off the dole and go on the scheme, then you might get a tenner extra a week, and you could also work. It was a thing to try and encourage people to start their own business. So we were both there. I was there to sing, and he was there to do production.
The two quickly became acquainted and began working together. And at the time, Gibbons was a local singer covering artists such as Janis Joplin in local pubs around Bristol. She was inspired by the likes of Janis Joplin and Otis Redding. She exchanged demo tapes of her music with Jeff Barrow and his demo tapes. And initially, they did not think their musical styles would be able to mesh with one another, but the juxtaposition between the two struggling musicians intrigued both of them. Gibbons' haunting yet soulful vocals and lyrics combined with Barrow's hip-hop samples and dark instrumentals blended together, creating a sound that no one had heard before. The first song the two recorded together was It Could Be Sweet. Beth Gibbons already had the lyrics ready, fitting for a completely different type of sound, but Barrow insisted she sang over an instrumental he had ready to go, and this essentially was the start of Portishead. The duo started recording music in Coach House Studios in Bristol, and while working in the studio, 19-year-old Jeff Barrow and 26-year-old Beth Gibbons overheard a guitar being played in another part of the studio. Barrow liked the tone that he was hearing, and he soon found himself chopping it up with the one behind the strings, Adrian Utley. The 34-year-old was a seasoned guitar player playing in jazz bands and also had collaborated with people like Jeff Beck. In a 2011 interview for The Guardian, Utley said, "When I first met Jeff, we vibed on each other even though there was an age difference and a musical difference, and that hasn't really gone. Portishead is a world where I know exactly what's going on, and somehow it's almost like it's the real world and everything else is playtime." The three became acquainted, and Utley started to infuse his guitar tone into Portishead's tracks, complementing Gibbons' vocals and Barrow's beats. He was the missing link to the band, and when the three came together, they built the foundation of a long, lustrous musical career. Clive Deemer was a friend of Utley's who played drums on Portishead tracks and still tours with them today. In an interview, he stated, "While Utley was dealing with the frustrations of some of the realities of being a jazz musician, never much achieving anything in the recorded work, he took a room at the Coach House studio where he first met Jeff. And I remember encouraging Adrian to take the room. I said, 'Look, you're a great musician, you've got great ideas, you should be working on recordings as opposed to just going out and playing gigs, and those gigs just being lost to the wind.'" With Gibbons on vocals and Barrow as the beat maker, now including Adrian Utley assisting with the guitar, the band started to work on their first album, Dummy. Dummy was released in 1994, and the album quickly garnered success, something the band did not expect to happen. In an extremely rare interview with Beth Gibbons, when asked about the debut album, she said, "I do get nervous and paranoid and that other stuff, but really, it was the fact that when the album came out, I wasn't sure if it was any good or not. You could have said it was crap and I'd probably have agreed with you."
I mean, we were only hoping to sell, if we sold 50,000, we were going to be well chuffed. Really. We just wanted to sell enough to do the second album.
Were you aware that it was such a unique sound, what Portishead had captured?
No, I don't think so. I think I thought it was a bit slow and that it might be not very sellable.
Dummy was a deep, dark journey into heartbreak and paranoia. Barrow's dusty, down-tempo beats, heavily infused with hip-hop samples, combined with Utley's guitar playing and of course Beth Gibbons' grueling lyrical content and soft but intense vocals, shot the band into newfound stardom. The sound was moody and cinematic, with obvious influences from neo-noir spy films of the 60s and 70s. Barrow, being obsessed with these James Bond-type films, infused the record with eerie samples, and Utley's guitar tone sounded like it was being played in a dark, smoky barroom. One of the gnarliest things about the entire sound of the album was Jeff Barrow's genius sampling techniques. To start, he had a session drummer, an unofficial fourth member of the band, Clive Deemer, lay down various grooves, which were recorded onto a half-inch 16-track tape, a format that was already somewhat outdated and restrictive. But that was just the beginning. Barrow would then take those drum recordings and have them pressed onto vinyl. What followed was borderline sacrilege to any collector. We'd record a drum break and Jeff would get it on vinyl, then he'd chuck it on the floor and kick it around so it was a bit crackly. He would get it on his deck and just scratch on the snare drum bit to make it go dull, Utley said in an interview. Once the vinyl had been thoroughly mistreated, scuffed, crackling, and warped, it was then sampled, chopped into beats, and run through more layers of sonic manipulation into the mixing stage. Other instruments went through the same process, giving Dummy its signature, dusty, decaying cinematic texture. And funny enough, when the record first came out, people that bought the record would return it because they thought it was scratched or broken or mishandled in the shipping process, and the record store owners had to explain to all the consumers and customers that is exactly how the record was intended to sound, and Portishead did it on purpose. It's kind of genius. But beyond the vintage sound and gloomy hip-hop samples was Beth Gibbons' voice and her lyrics, both equally as haunting. It's almost as if she wasn't singing, but she was pleading. Whether she was pleading for help, forgiveness, or change, that's entirely her business, but it definitely belonged to her and she let it out through the microphone. The intensity in her delivery made it impossible to not get pulled into her own despair. You didn't really just listen to her, but you felt her unravel. Each line sounded like it came from someone on the edge and yet somehow still composed enough to whisper it into a microphone. Lyrics like on the track Wandering Star, she confesses, "Please could you stay a while to share my grief, for it's such a lovely day to have to always feel this way." Her lyrics are soaked in a sense of devastation, carrying some heavy burden on her shoulders, only to release some of its pressure when she sings the thoughts that come to her. Dummy was a slow burn. Yes, it gave the band much attention in comparison to how they were unknown starving artists before its release, but when it did come out in August of '94, it slowly had to climb the charts. By January of '95, it peaked at number 3 on the UK charts, right behind Celine Dion. Numb, Sour Times, and Glory Box were the 3 singles from the record, with the latter 2 giving heavy airplay. Even though Barrow was more interested in recording in the studio rather than touring, the band began to play live shows to support Dummy. Their standout singles, specifically Sour Times, received heavy airplay on MTV, and the band was experiencing success for the first time. In a New York Times interview years after Dummy was released, Jeff Barrow spoke on the debut album's success, stating, "Those people bought the record and made the band big, but it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? In the sense that people actually having a dinner party and putting our music on. I would want to go in with a baseball bat and smash the shit out of their fondue set." The band commanded stage presence in an unorthodox way. Barrow always in the back on the ones and twos, Utley looking mysterious while infusing his jazz and funk sounds into the guitar, Clive Deemer filling in on the drums, and Beth Gibbons, eyes closed, gripping onto the microphone with a cigarette in her same hand, belting out her haunting vocals. It wasn't like the band was trying to win over their audience. They were dragging the audience into their own world without hesitation. Portishead, although incognito, melancholic figures, began to emerge from the shadows completely in September 1995 when they won the Mercury Music Prize, beating out 140 other artists such as Oasis, Blur, and Tricky.
But you seem deadly surprised to win this, is that right?
Well, the thing is, I was just having a drink with someone, for God's sake, you know what I mean? It's like, I was there having a drink, and then all of a sudden, someone says, Portishead, and I just didn't even know what was going on. Walk up to the top, you know what I mean, and say something kind of profound and pop star-ish, you know what I mean, which I think really particularly vocabulary. And there we're in front of all these cameras, which is absolutely ridiculous to my sense of reality. You know what I mean? Abel will agree with this, and everyone will agree with this. This is absolutely stupid.
And a side note you might find interesting is that in 1995, that was the only year that Beth Gibbons essentially ever gave any sort of interviews on camera. She's extremely shy, and she's somehow stayed out of the limelight and stayed away from the press for over 30 years. And I think personally that's pretty impressive to be a singer for a major band and capable of essentially never giving interviews and never putting yourself out there unless it's through your music. I think it's impressive. You can easily see her shyness in these rare interviews, especially when she laughs, when you can tell she's just trying to hide the fact that she's uncomfortable.
So I stumped you straight up.
No, I don't like anything. Same sound of Portishead.
He was so crap at this.
The mystery of her is quite intriguing, but when Jeff Barrow was asked about his bandmate and how she was as a person, all he said is that it came down to her extreme shyness. To us, it just comes down to the music. If people like it, they go out and buy it. Obviously, you've got a right to be intrigued about the person who's singing and all, but to us, we're pretty boring. We go into the studio, we make records, and then we come home. Guitarist Adrian Utley also stated, "What, you think that she was the dark lady who arrives in the dark car and gets wheeled out? That's interesting. Beth's a day-to-day person. We can talk about bread or how crap it is when you can't park, how awful it is when your relationship ends or one of your parents dies, as well as what washing up gloves to get. There's a darkness within everyone, and she's in touch with that stuff. And that's more interesting to her than singing, 'Get up, get on up.' It's fantastic when James Brown does it, but I can't imagine her doing that." Since Dummy's success in the band's newfound stardom, Portishead went on their first hiatus. This wasn't the kind of break taken to bask in fame. It was almost just like a retreat. The members had never been interested in the spotlight, and with the massive attention that followed Dummy, they found themselves needing to recalibrate. In the years following, they kept their distance, choosing instead to focus on creating music that felt authentic rather than feeding into the media expectations. It wasn't until 1997 that Portishead returned with their self-titled second album. Unlike Dummy, which was built heavily on samples, Portishead leaned darker, more abrasive, and way more cinematic. They recorded much of the material themselves, pressing it onto vinyl, only to sample it back into their own compositions, a process that gave the album its raw, almost paranoid texture. Songs like All Mine, Only You, and Over showcase Beth Gibbons' vulnerability against harsher production. The band was deliberately pulling away from the trip-hop label that Bristol had become synonymous with, carving out their own distinct space. When Adrian Utley was asked why it took 3 years from the time Dummy was released for them to drop their second album, he said, "Since the last one we toured for quite a long time. Once we came off tour, I can't even remember which year, we went straight into producing the new record. We changed our technique in that time. We stopped using samples of anyone else's music, which meant that we had to make them ourselves, play, record, and go through many, many processes." It was a long affair. That was one reason, and the other was that we vaguely kind of lost our way in that time. Their self-titled album was what defined Portishead as their own entity, setting them apart from the trip-hop genre that the media placed on them and their contemporaries. Many of Gibbons' lyrics place an emphasis on the critique of Western capitalism and materialism, on songs like Half Day Closing, where she says, "Far beyond the shrinking skies, where money talks and leaves us hypnotized, it don't pave the way, underneath the fading sun. The silent sum of a businessman has left us choking." The mere focus on original production from both Barrow and Utley makes the album stand out as the band's ascension into greatness. In '97, the same year they released their self-titled album, the band recorded their live record at the Roseland Ballroom in New York City. Here's the thing, everyone that knows me personally knows that I think Alice in Chains' live MTV Unplugged show in 1996 is the greatest live concert ever recorded, but Portishead in '97 at the Roseland Ballroom, it's up there. Some critics throughout Portishead's early start mentioned how hard it would be for a band with such heavy production and heavy sampling and turntable focus to perform live. But Portishead was like, screw that, and showed up on stage with a 28-piece orchestra and gave a legendary performance. The band rehearsed for about a month before performing live. Although they played a handful of songs from Dummy, a majority of the setlist was comprised of songs from their self-titled album. It's important to note that Portishead hadn't yet performed any of their songs off their second album live yet, and also didn't even perform them in the studio. Just as usual, Beth Gibbons' haunting vocals flooded the theater with Barrow's turntables going to work and Utley's jazzy guitar tones being complemented by the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. The new songs were received with praise from the crowd, my personal favorite being Only You. The performance was a defining moment for Portishead's career, not only expanding their audience, but displaying their talent and unique sound in a live setting, quickly shutting down the notion that they wouldn't be able to put on a good show due to their sampling and unorthodox techniques of implementing so many electronic sounds into their music. And most notably, Beth Gibbons didn't have much experience singing live. Prior to Portishead, she was singing Janis Joplin covers in local pubs around Bristol. And for someone who is notoriously shy, only given a handful of interviews in a 30-year period, her comfortability on stage is nothing short of amazing. And with her gloomy, painful lyrics echoed through the ballroom, one must wonder why this gentle, reserved, shy but smiley woman seems to carry this heavy weight that she expresses through singing. Again, in another rare interview, she stated, "I do have an emptiness, but then again, everyone does to a lesser or greater degree. I tend to dwell on mine more than other people do, which I'm sure manifests itself in my lyrics. Suffering for your art is most definitely overrated, but I do get a certain satisfaction from being able to deal with my paranoia and insecurity. I wake up sometimes and think, no way am I going to be able to get through the day, but then you do at the end of it and you feel a tiny bit stronger." With the live performance over, which was released as a record in '98, Portishead yet again went on another hiatus. This time it seemed like all three band members had to grow in their personal lives, especially since they had been touring for years since the start. When asked about this prolonged break after '98, Jeff Barrow said, "I quit music for a bit. I couldn't find anything I liked musically in anybody, in anything." Adrian Utley also stated, "We'd done so many things. We toured so much, been working on our albums, we were pretty much burned out. Our family and our home life was pretty much in a meltdown at that time. We needed to take some time out, so that's what we did." Although the band didn't officially quit, they took a break from touring and working in the studio. Utley and Barrow worked collectively on side projects, but nothing major came from it. In 2002, Beth Gibbons released her debut solo album, Out of Season, while Barrow retreated to Australia, creating his own experimental record label with the help of Adrian Utley, with both of the men going through their own divorces at the time. Barrow explained that the band had exhausted every single idea they had, with no real motivation or creative spark to work on a fourth Portishead album. However, after years of experimenting with new projects, the three got back together in the studio and began to build the foundation for their next album, Third. "We always had an idea about what we wanted," said Utley. "We didn't want it to sound like old Portishead, Glory Box, or Cowboys or anything, but we do reference our own albums in spirit." He added, "We were more interested in dissonance, darker, colder sounds. We talked about that a lot." The album seemed like a long, grueling process. The album took 3 years to complete, with the bandmates saying it was like pulling teeth even to find one chord. Portishead didn't want this album to sound like Dummy 2.0 and was trying to once and for all eliminate the trip-hop genre that they were cornered into. A journalist described Third as sounding like Dummy and their self-titled album getting into a head-on collision and slowly piecing themselves back together in an old BBC studio. Released on April 28, 2008, Third proved that Portishead never left. They just took the time to finally display their ability to never sound the same, all while keeping grounded in their musical roots. In its own unique personality, the album sounded like it was bruised from head to toe, each sound being perfectly calculated and distorted at the same time. I personally didn't even understand the album when I first listened to it. It didn't sound like anything that I've heard before. Beth Gibbons did not disappoint with her vocals, yet again, flooding eardrums with lyrics like "tempted in our minds, tormented inside life, wounded and afraid, inside my head, falling through changes." On the album's opener, Silence. My personal favorite on the record is Threads, with lyrics like "I battle my thoughts, I find I can't explain, I've traveled so far but somehow feel the same." These lyrics in a way almost symbolize the sound of the album in contrast to their previous works. Rather than revisiting the past and dwelling on what it was like on Dummy and the self-titled album, she captured the anxieties of the present. Pitchfork magazine hailed it as a stark reinvention that erases trip-hop from the conversation, while The Guardian called it a masterpiece of controlled tension. NME praised the band's refusal to look backward, writing, "Portishead didn't return to reclaim their sound, they returned to destroy it." Despite its density and darkness, the album debuted at number 2 on the UK albums chart and number 7 on the Billboard 200, proving that even after a 10-year absence, Portishead's influence had only deepened. The band refused nostalgia and fully embraced the rupture of their musical past along with its critics. The band played about a dozen concerts in Europe and made a high-profile US appearance at Coachella Valley Music and Arts Festival in 2008, where Beth Gibbons even ran into the crowd and thanked the fans with a simple, "Thanks for waiting." Since 2008, Portishead activity has been completely sporadic. Whether it's releasing old archival material or reuniting in the studio in September 2025 to perform Rhodes for the Together for Palestine benefit, their movements remain unpredictable. Beth Gibbons made an appearance on Mother I Sober, a track from Kendrick Lamar's album Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers in 2022. In 2024, she released her second solo record, Lives Outgrown, which was met with critical acclaim, where she began her first ever solo US tour. Barrow was focused on production, running his label Invada Records, and exploring experimental projects, while Utley has composed film scores and collaborated with a variety of artists, maintaining the same meticulous genre-defying approach that defined Portishead from the start. But when it's all said and done, Portishead has carved themselves in stone as a musical composition that sounds like no other. Beyond the trip-hop label that they were thrown under, like many of the bands in the 90s under the grunge umbrella, the trio of musicians are the poster children for the saying, "slow and steady wins the race." Their influence is heavy, and their innovation of combining unheard of sampling techniques with haunting vocals and 60s spy film-inspired guitar tones, Portishead can't really be remembered just for one thing. But their music will always stand the test of time, and it really makes you appreciate the gloomy days. Portishead.